Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in several sectors of the front line. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance both within the Kursk region and within the Sumy region, capturing approximately 20 square kilometers of territory. The Russians also managed to advance in the eastern section of the front line near New York, and the area filled with fortified positions in between Toretsk and Pokrovsk. The Russians also managed to advance to the southwest of Pokrovsk, where fighting also continues in the direction of Lysivka and Kotline, where the Russian and Ukrainian forces are doing a bit of back and forth with the front line unchanged. The Russians also managed to advance to the northwest of Velika Novosilka in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. We see that the Russians continue their main efforts in the Donetsk region from Toretsk in the east to the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, and in the Sumy/Kursk region in the northern section of the front line, while the developments in the eastern section of the front line has slowed down following Ukrainian reinforcements that arrived in those areas, where they're preparing to launch some counterattacks following a stabilization of the front line. Starting out in the south, we see that the Russians have advanced in the direction of Shevchenko. The Russians are on the eastern outskirts of the town, and they are fighting over fortified positions north of Privilne and Vilnepole. The Russians are here looking to secure the flank ahead of a push into Vilnepole, following which they'll launch offensive operations into Shevchenko from the south and from the east, where the Russians will look to gain control over Shevchenko just south of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here near the outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians are generally operating here in the direction of the final line of defense the Ukrainians have available in this sector of the front line, following which they will likely look to bypass the fortified positions by attacking them from the rear and their weak points from the northern flank, following the capture of this defensive line. Therefore, the main efforts of the Russians are here to the northwest of Velika Novosilka in the direction of Vilnepole, Shevchenko, and Fedorivka, around the final line of defense of the Ukrainians here west of the Mokryeli river line, which spans all the way towards the Dnipropetrovsk region, separating the eastern and western parts of it. The Russians also managed to advance to the south of Sripne and Bohdanivka, where they're looking to close yet another pocket that they are attempting to form here to the north of Andrivka. This will completely secure the northern flank of Andrivka for a push towards the fortified positions to the northwest of the town, and then onwards towards Oleksivka and the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region. Also secure the southern flank of Bohdanivka for offensive operations towards Toretsk and Horihove from the southern flank, combined with offensive operations from the northern flanks, putting them in a pincer maneuver to cut off the flanks and supplies of the Ukrainian forces in the area, and to isolate towns such as Toretsk and Horihove from the remaining areas. Further north, the Russians and the Ukrainians clashed near Kotline and Lysivka. The Russians launched a counterattack here west of Kotline following the Ukrainian recapture of the town, where they are looking to flank the supply lines of the Ukrainians, cut off their supplies, and attack from the northern and western flanks to encircle the Ukrainian forces within the town and regain full control of it by capturing the outposts in the northern and western flanks. This will allow the Russians to re-secure the town following the Ukrainian counterattacks in the areas. The Russians also continue their fighting within the Sivka in the northern and southern bank of the river line, where they're looking to gain full control over the town, following which they'll advance in the northern direction towards Sokhiyar and to the north of Dashenske in the direction of the fortified positions, where they will close the gap from the western and eastern flanks, bypassing the river line with the bridgehead across. Further to the east, there are several developments both within Toretsk and to the southwest of New York. The Russians closed the gap here to the southwest of Alexandropol, capturing the Ukrainian forces that were encircled in the area, gaining control over this section of the front line, and developing offensive operations west of Alexandropol, gaining full control over the first fortified positions near Novobakhmutivka. The Russians will then advance along the main highway and in a northwestern direction to bypass the fortified positions the Ukrainians have available near the southeast of Kalinove, to cut them off and encircle them with the river line to the east and the river line to the west. They'll be able to encircle the Ukrainian forces within these fortified positions in this area and strike the Ukrainian positions within Kalinove to gain a foothold within the eastern and western parts of the town, to completely encircle the Ukrainian forces and fight over the fortified positions near the town. The Russians at the same time in an area where they can bypass fortified positions northwest of Kalinove through their positions within Sinopole, from which the Russians could look to bypass fortified positions completely and move towards the reservoir to the north of Kalinove. And with a push from the eastern flank, they'll be able to not just encircle the southeastern fortifications of Kalinove, but also the northwestern ones by creating an encirclement along the river line northeast of Kalinove to the one to the southeast of Kalinove, and with the forest lines to the northwest of the town. The Russian capture of the fortified positions to the northwest of Novobakhmutivka also secures the main highway from the city of Donetsk itself through Avdiivka and onwards towards Konstantinivka, where the Russians are looking to properly supply their forces with the use of this highway as the main supply hub. They need to control Sukhabelka and Velinitivka from the east and Kalinove to the west to gain control over the central defensive lines here along the main defensive line, following which there is this final defensive position near Romanivka, following which the road from Donetsk will be open all the way to the reservoir south of Konstantinivka, reaching just a few kilometers from Konstantinivka itself. And this will significantly improve the supply situation for the Russian forces, as they'll have two supply lines, the one from Orlivka to the east and the one from Donetsk to the south, to supply their forces in the southern flank of Konstantinivka, while they have their supply lines from Luhansk in the east towards Bakhmut, and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk from the north towards Bakhmut for the eastern flank of Konstantinivka, and this improves the logistical situation for the Russian forces for a large concentration of forces in this section of the front line. The Russians also managed to advance in the western outskirts of Toretsk, where the Russians have now gained control over the final residential and urban area of the city. In the western outskirts of it, there is this part in the southwestern outskirts and in the northeastern outskirts, which the Russians have yet to gain control over. This means that the Russians do not have full control over the city of Toretsk yet. There are still the two waste heaps in the northeastern parts, and there's the fortified positions on the western outskirts near the forest patches, which the Russians have yet to gain control over. However, it is only a matter of days or weeks before the Russians gain control over the remaining parts, following which they'll fight over the industrial area in the northern outskirts and the railway in the northwestern parts of the city, to cut off the main supply hub for the Ukrainian forces and supply lines. The Russians will then look to gain full control over Novosibirsk and Sherbinivka to the west of the city to significantly improve their positions in the area. And with the offensive in the southwest of New York as well, the Russians will look to align the front line with the main highway and fortified positions and the reservoir to significantly improve the positions here to the west of Toretsk, before moving onwards towards the city of Konstantinivka in the north. In the northern section of the front line, there are two advances by the Russians. There's been an advance within the Kursk region, where the Russians have reached the outskirts of Oleshnya from the southeast. With this, the Ukrainians barely have any positions here in the main parts of the Kursk region. They still held a larger area near Goronel along the main forest patches and forest lines to the southwest of Koevo. However, the Ukrainians are now on their last moments here in the Kursk region as well as in the Belgorod region, where they are almost completely expelled from the entirety of Russian territory, and this would mean that the fighting would completely return to Ukraine itself. At the same time, the Russians have also managed to advance within the Sumy region between Vasilivka and Shuravka and Basivka, aligning the front line here in the northwest. The objective of the Russians is to improve their positions on a wider area and create a wide buffer zone. The Russians currently control approximately 60 square kilometers within the Sumy region, and with this we see the Russians continue offensive operations here towards the city itself through the northern flank. According to Ukrainian sources, they are expecting the Russians to launch a larger scale offensive towards Sumy in the coming months, whether it is in May or in June, and they expect the Russians to look to gain full control over the city through an encirclement of it. For this, we would need to do an analysis of the potential scenario from which the Russians will look to gain control over Sumy, and it is actually a realistic one, as the city of Sumy has a smaller population than the city of Mariupol, and it is currently standing at about 250,000 people, where Mariupol prior to the war had over 400,000, I believe more than 500,000 people living there. This means that this is approximately half the size of Mariupol in terms of population. It is still a large city with a lot of people. This would make it very difficult to gain control of it. However, with a large offensive, including over 100,000 troops by the Russian forces to encircle the city, it is a possible operation. And therefore, my next video will be an analysis of this potential scenario, which we may see within the next few months. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.